of it. So they have that information because they were in those meetings. We don't. I was actually, frankly, surprised that they sent us a binder at all.
We start with friend of the show, Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator, what is the legal protection that allows individuals who attend meetings like this to work as financial professionals at subsidized banks that have federal bank charters, and yet the American taxpayer who pays for the whole thing, even years after, we still can't get real transparency from an organization and an administration that claims to be so?
Well, Dylan, what I will tell you is we are currently working with a group of economists on a reform bill to make fundamental changes in the way the Fed does business. And clearly the issue of conflict of interest is huge, and the issue of transparency is huge. The American people have a right to know what's going on. They have a right to know that people who are working for the Fed are working for the best interest of ordinary Americans. And when they leave the Fed, they're not going to go out and make a whole lot of money with the information that they have obtained. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of transparency, in terms of openness, in terms of ending conflicts of interest. And that's something we are working on.
We asked Attorney General Beau Biden of Delaware about this yesterday. Take a listen.
Transparency in government, transparency in the Fed is critical. We want to be able to have a situation where people from the private sector can go serve. There are very smart people in the private sector that want to serve this nation. They should be able to do that and return to the private sector. So I'm not, a bright line against that, but we got to figure out a way that we do it in a way that those people, that when they leave public service, they don't go then work for the very agencies that they regulate and help that agency, or rather that company, subvert or get around the regulations that they promulgated.
Isn't that exactly what we have, however, Senator?
Well, I think in many respects you do. And I think that is an issue that has to be addressed, and we intend to deal with it. Look, the bottom line is, Dylan, that the Fed is an agency of extraordinary importance, frankly, one of the most important agencies of government. Very few people know what it does, the impact it has on society. That is why, as part of the Dodd-Frank bill, as you know, we worked hard for the first time to have an audit of the Fed, at least during the emergency period, which, to my mind, brought forth some very startling revelations that I know you're familiar with. We learned that $16 trillion in a revolving loan was lent out to every major financial institution in America, central banks all over the world, large corporations in America. And one of the goals that we have got to work for is to make sure that the Fed serves not only the needs of the large financial institutions, 6 of which, by the way, have assets equivalent to 2/3 of the GDP of America, but ordinary people, small business people. How do you do that? How do you make the Fed more democratic? That is a real challenge that we have to address.
What is it that would incentivize the level of secrecy at the Federal Reserve? Why would what are the decisions being made in these meetings that they would try to enforce such an incredible level of secrecy that they do? And why is it okay for something so secret then to be known by 30 to 40 people who now work at Wall Street investment banks using that information? I don't understand.
Well, you know what their argument would be. If Mr. Bernanke, was before you, what he would probably tell you, I don't want to speak for him, is that they need this level of secrecy because of information about the nature of the economy, and what the Fed was planning to do was made public tomorrow. It could cause negative impacts to the whole economy. Having said that, I believe that we can and should have a lot more transparency than we do right now.
I guess what I'm saying, I'm sorry to interrupt, but so if we accepted that rebuttal, which I agree with you, that's an interpretation of the rebuttal, that I could accept that. It's not obviously not my authority to accept or reject that level of secrecy. But in the face of that level of secrecy, how is it appropriate for these people to be employed at Wall Street investment banks where they take big paychecks when they're dealing in such secret information? I'm confused.
No, you're right. I think that is a very good point, and that speaks to the issue of conflicts of interest. Do you want to have the Federal Reserve dominated by folks who come from some of the largest financial institutions in America, go to the Fed, leave the Fed, go back to the financial industry? I think you want to be very careful about that. I would also say, if I might, Dylan, that I know it's a point you've made many, many times. If we're going to get this economy right, if we're going to reverse the decline of the middle class, We have got to focus on the Fed. We have got to focus on Wall Street. And one of the issues where I hope the Fed would be more outspoken about is the need to break up these huge financial institutions, six of which have assets equivalent to 2/3 of the GDP of this country. Is that really good for America? Is that really dealing with the issue of too big to fail when 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions are bigger today than they were before we bailed them out? I would like to see the Fed get involved in that as well.
Why wouldn't they?
Well, I think that they should. I think, the answer is conflicts of interest. Who does the Fed work for? Does the Fed work for ordinary Americans? Or is the Fed heavily influenced by the big money interest on Wall Street? I think most people would assume the latter, that Wall Street has an enormous role in determining Fed policy.
I want you to play a cultural analyst for me. I believe ultimately that whatever rules we make, whatever money does, dictates the culture. That culture dictates the rules. Russia had a full revolution, but if the culture is still to exploit, then the culture will still be to exploit. When you look at something like the number of times laughter or the joking or sort of the silliness of some of these types of notes, is that just cheap pot shots from people like me that can run word searches, or is there any legitimate cultural insight as to the lack of seriousness with which some of these conversations, or at least the lack of realization of how connected they actually are to everybody else?
Dylan, I really can't answer that. I don't know the context of that. I mean, is Ben Bernanke? I voted, by the way, against Bernanke being reappointed to head the Fed. But having said that, am I going to sit here and tell you that he's not a serious guy? He's a serious person. He's trying to do his best. I happen to disagree with him. But the bottom line is, and it's a huge issue, and I'm glad that you are focusing on it because not a lot of people do. Question, how do we democratize the Fed in the sense of making it more responsive to the needs of ordinary people rather than just Wall Street? How do we have the Fed, for example, the Fed lent out in a revolving loan fund $16 trillion in low or zero interest loans during the emergency crisis. Why aren't they helping out small business people in the way they helped out some of the largest financial institutions in this country? How do we make sure that the people who are appointed to the Fed come from backgrounds that understand the pain that is existing economically in this country today, rather than just from big Wall Street firms?
I agree, and the search for answers obviously continues. Like Ryan Grimm said over the Huffington Post, on the one hand, the glass half full is they did send us a binder. Thank you, Senator. We invite everyone, especially all those financial bloggers out there, to dig into the minutes themselves. The full downloadable FOIA request is up at DylanRatigan.com. Surely there are things to be discovered in there that we have not yet found. And thanks to our friends at the Huffington Post for collaborating with us on this series. You can check out their reporting by Washington Bureau Chief Ryan Grimm